All right, so my name is Carolyn, and I'm a software developer based in Berlin, Germany. I'm currently working at a machine learning startup called Mishkin, which is actually based in Helsinki. And I'm also a Mozilla tech speaker. It's important to note, though, that before I was a developer, I was a technical writer. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. So, today I'm here to talk about making our docs more human friendly. We're going to cover a lot in the next 30 minutes. So, I've left this link where it has every article or talk that I mention, and I will also share it again at the end. So, sit back, relax, it'll be fun. And for the sake of this talk, we're going to focus on external facing documentation. So, the information that describes your product to its users. All right, let's get going. I want to start with a question. Why do we even write documentation? Is it because someone told us to do it, like our managers or the acceptance criteria on our ticket? Or is it because we actually want to help the people using our products accomplish their goals? Writing documentation tends to be an afterthought and something that we just kind of get done. But what if we decided to take the same approach, or what if we decided to approach documentation with the same care and consideration that we give the features we ship? Those questions lay the foundation for what's known as use case driven documentation. Use case driven documentation derives from the concept of goal driven documentation, both of which were coined and made popular by Tyner Blaine in 2006. And it works like this: make your users' goals the focal point of your docs instead of just describing interface elements from left to right. To illustrate why having a goal centric approach is important, Tyner Blaine uses the example of a power drill. They say that if you were to document this drill the same way that most document software, we'd end up with something like this: how to adjust the speed, how to change the direction of the drill, how to change the drill bit. So now you know how to operate the drill, but you don't actually know how to accomplish anything with it. These are examples of what's called reference docs. They're information oriented, describe the machinery, and they're usually accurate. But if we change our perspective and focus on what it takes to do the job and not just use the tool, we could end up with something like this: how to drill a hole in a flat surface, whether it's wood or metal, how to select the right screw for fastening items, how to stir paint with your drill. Suddenly, the documentation is helping us achieve our goals. To begin to understand why this approach is successful, we need to think about that first question: why do we even write documentation? And perhaps more importantly, we should be asking, who do we write documentation for? And the answer is pretty straightforward: humans. Yes, with the development of sophisticated bots and AI, this answer could change pretty soon. But for now, most software documentation is written with the idea that humans will read it. And humans need that guidance that documentation is meant to provide. That's why those same principles from the drill can apply to our products as well. Yes, we want to write documentation to teach someone how to work our software, sure. But we also want to be teaching them how to achieve their goals and solve their problems using our software. So let's apply this to something a little bit more applicable to our industry, say Slack. Because I know they have a developer portal, I crawled their site for examples a while back. And these were a few of the titles that I found. As expected, we have those information-oriented reference docs. They teach us about making our messages interactive, how to subscribe to event types, and the differences between the Events API and the real-time messaging API. That's nice, but even as someone who uses Slack daily, I'm still not sure why I would need any of these functions. So this is a probably outdated screenshot from the same docs, just a different page. But notice how they are not only giving us use cases, create simple workflows, build bots, but they're also outlining what we can accomplish. We can create that simple workflow by having our app respond to users' activities, or we can build a bot to automate tasks. Plus, they point you to those reference docs that were from the previous slide. Now that we generally understand what use case driven documentation is, let's look at a high level outline of this idea. When you want to develop a use case, you typically start with a goal. Then, if you're using use case driven development or something similar, the rest of your workflow could look something like this. You'll define the functional requirement, you'll design the product, and then you'll implement the feature. What most documentation is doing, however, is starting at the implementation phase. It's once you've already finished that feature, and this is okay, it works, the docs get done. But what a use case driven approach is proposing is that we start here at, maybe you guessed it, the use case. The beauty of this is that you can design your documentation simultaneously with the features that you're developing. When we use a structured approach like this, we have established a framework for defining the problems that our software will solve. We articulate how people solve those problems with use cases, and then those use cases define exactly what we need to document. So this is cool, but it doesn't usually happen like this, even with the best intentions. One of the problems is that this use case driven approach requires a fundamental change to how your team tackles documentation. Also, those reference docs, the ones that only explain what the software can do, they're actually the reasons why docs have such a bad rep in this industry, because they tend to be pretty dry and leave us wanting more. I know this feeling all too well from when I was first learning JavaScript. Before taking a proper course, I found it really difficult to learn JavaScript. It was literally like, what the hell is going on? Why is this so confusing? And like, seriously, do people actually enjoy this? I still wonder about the last one sometimes, but I just kept running into documentation that left me feeling completely deflated after. There was a lot of unexplained jargon and assumed knowledge, and a lot of times my questions were still left unanswered. And I noticed that this hasn't really changed, even though I now feel proficient with JavaScript. So, this experience, plus feeling slightly underappreciated back when I was a technical writer, left me with the impression that nobody actually wants to read documentation. Because I certainly didn't. Plus, it's true that people typically visit docs when they're feeling frustrated with the software and they're disappointed that they haven't been able to solve the problem on their own. Recognizing and validating these feelings in technical writing is really important. These emotions frame the reader's perspective, and therefore they should be shaping the mood of our docs. But now that I'm deep into the developer world, I also realize that this statement isn't entirely true either. What I have realized is that people don't mind reading, and they might even be thankful for your docs, as long as they're actually helpful. Or, I mean, really at least more helpful than they are confusing. But a lot of documentation isn't. And that's why it's still a huge pain point for many developers. If you search the term reading docs on Twitter, you'll see that most of the tweets aren't super positive. Here are some that I found a while back. Hi, I was reading your documentation and you described this data in 2 different ways, which is correct. Thank you. The way it works is third completely different description. And Ethan actually told me that this was from a large organization. You might know them. They do a lot of work with like space. So just because an organization is large and has resources doesn't mean it magically gets better. Next one, the process of learning how to write a plugin. 1, read the docs. 2, get console log output. 3, read more. 4, try literally anything else. 5, get errors. 6, read more docs. 7, read existing plugin source. 8, notice it's written completely differently than what the docs say. And 9, cry a little. Honestly, though, I go through a similar journey, except the crying comes like much, much earlier. And my personal favorite, bad documentation is bad. And even after someone asked if there were no docs, would it be better? Lee still said, deep thoughts. Honestly, yes, because it would waste less of my time. So yeah, people love to hate documentation. But that's because most of the documentation they're finding isn't fulfilling their needs. Back when I was a technical writer, I used to think that if only I could convince developers to care more, then they'll think about how they craft documentation as deeply as I did. I was like this sort of like weird documentation evangelist that no one asked for. But again, now that I'm a developer full time, I know that that's also just not always possible. Because even if a developer really cares, they're almost never going to have the time to think about things like comprehensive learning journeys, doc app content architecture, or debate over every little word if their job doesn't have the word writer in it. But there are small, tangible actions that we can take to improve our documentation. And that's what I want to focus on for this talk. We can start by looking at the words we are writing. So a few days ago, I was listening to an old episode of the Write the Docs podcast featuring technical writer Lucy Lenore. And she made some really good points about why the words we choose in our docs matter. She mentioned how word choice can go a long way in promoting inclusion, and we'll cover some of that today. But she also mentioned that as documentation becomes more advanced, like particularly through artificial intelligence and helper bots, this word choice will play a large role in how these tools learn and the subsequent materials that they'll create. And we want those to be as neutral and inclusive as possible. So that's all to say that this topic matters, whether you approach it from a more human perspective or a technical one. Anyway, back to the practical stuff. So most importantly, we want to make sure that these words that we choose are optimized for comprehension. One blocker to this goal is insensitive language. And this one can be tricky because across nationalities and personalities, insensitive phrasing or wording can mean a lot of different things. In this case, it includes profanity and pretty much anything that would break a code of conduct. Take this for example. If the programmer wishes to uphold the invariant, he must satisfy the function's preconditions. Now, you might think that gendered language is a relatively tame example, but even so, it can have negative effects on the members of your community and their own sense of belonging. In software development, we also have these problematic, dated, and mostly racist terms that we're still using even though it's 2020. Terms like master and slave or whitelist and blacklist. A good rule to follow is that when documenting code, you don't want to make any assumptions about race, gender, religion, political orientation, or anything else that isn't relevant to the project. For the previous examples, we can use the alternatives primary and replica, or deny list and allow list. I've also heard that block list and safe list works pretty well as well. And not only are these less racist, but they actually better describe their purpose through their semantics. But there's so much more than those 4 words that we need to watch out for. And I understand that it can be a lot to think about. So I have a linter for you. So AlexJS catches insensitive, polarizing writing in your Markdown files. You can use it on the command line or as an integration with Atom, VS Code, or even Slack. It's also open source, so if you notice it's not catching something you think it should, you can submit a pull request. Here are those same examples from earlier, but now Alex is helping us catch those words that are better left out of our docs, as well as suggesting alternatives. I wouldn't recommend AlexJS for all types of writing because it does flag identity terms, like queer, for example, but it's great for technical documentation because for most cases, those shouldn't be present anyway. And because we're developers and have a tendency to want to automate everything, it's important to warn that linters aren't a replacement for human editing. And just because you're using a linter that will flag these quote unquote insensitive terms doesn't mean you shouldn't still educate yourself on why those terms are harmful. For that, I'd recommend checking out Tatiana Mack's Self-Defined Dictionary. It seeks to provide more inclusive and holistic definitions to reflect diverse perspectives. What I like about it is that it explains the issue with a particular word or phrase, the impact that it has on various communities, and also some alternatives. Plus, it's also open source. Next, kind of on the same topic, but saying simply or easy in our documentation. So Jim Fisher opened the 2018 edition of Write the Docs Prague conference with a talk on this exact topic. At one point, he searched for the word simply on GitHub and found over 92 million references to it in documentation, which is wild because when you think about it, if you've been stuck on a problem, do you really want to read something that describes it as simple? What we can do is ban isolating words like easy, simple, obviously from our docs. This is already common practice for many technical writers, and we can use these practices to be more mindful of the words that we're choosing. If you're struggling to find alternatives, Jim Fisher, who I mentioned earlier, has some suggestions. We can be more specific. Maybe your product is easy because it's quick to set up or doesn't require much custom configuration. If that's the case, say so. Or you can be comparative. Something is smaller than something else or requires fewer steps to create. You can also be absolute. It takes 5 lines of code to integrate this with your project. When you suggest being absolute, lots of people immediately jump to time as a measurement to show how easy something is, like launch a website in 10 minutes, build your own server from scratch in 30 seconds, etc. In this case, it's recommended to show and not tell. If you think it really takes 5 minutes to set up your tool, I would challenge you to make a video and see if that number still holds. Jim did this during his talk, and let's just say it proved the point. If we want to enforce this rule, we can also use a linter. Linters are very popular technical writing. So the AlexJS linter that I mentioned earlier also finds these terms, but I wanted to provide you with another option as well. WriteGood is another linter for English prose, and it's available as a command line tool, and I think someone recently wrote a VS Code plugin for it. Once installed, you can run this command to do a general check on all Markdown files. It automatically flags for simply and easily, and you can also write a custom check to look out for other problematic words that your team frequently uses. For instance, I know a team that created one to scan for the word just. The next one might be the most common. So often what I see in documentation is that there will be these like long, verbose chunks of text with bloated language. And by this, I mean overly complicated prose that are difficult to understand on the first read, particularly for those who might have a learning disability or aren't reading in their native language. We want to choose our language intentionally, and using plain language is crucial for more inclusive documentation. One tool that we can use to make sure our language isn't too complicated is Hemingway Editor. So here you can paste in your text and it'll highlight problematic words and sentences for you. It flags mainly long, complex sentences, unnecessary words, or words with a simpler alternative. The main downside is that it uses color and the mouse over event to distinguish these fields, which isn't the most accessible. But you'll also almost never completely satisfy it, but that's okay. What's most important to note is that on the right-hand side, you can see a readability score, and we want to keep that down to a maximum of a grade 8. And don't ever worry about the reading score being too low, because as the amazing Ashley Bischoff once said, no one has ever complained that something was too easy to read. And actually, if you want more tangible examples of plain language in writing, check out her talk from Frontiers. It's gold. Unexpected errors are another common issue people face. And while we can't necessarily prevent this through our documentation alone, we can make it better by considering and addressing common errors if you know them. So this helps reassure users that mistakes happen, and it provides options for troubleshooting. So when you're writing about these errors, you want to try to explain what might happen and why, and then tell the reader what to do next. This is a screenshot from the Apple II Basic Programming Manual from, yes, the 1970s. It tackles the nuances of common user errors quite well, explaining syntax errors before you even start to code. This tells us what happened. We got a beep in the syntax error message. Why? We pressed return. And what to do next? Ignore it. When formatting these error alerts in a tutorial, Django Girls is a great resource to reference. These notes are scattered throughout the tutorial, and the clear formatting enables it to be informative without being distracting for those who might not be encountering those errors. I've also seen like collapsible error messages work quite well. And finally, when it comes to our writing, you might be in too deep. So imagine you work for hours and hours, week after week, to build this product. You become so familiar with it to the point that you don't even cognitively recognize the core concepts as you're working with them. So then when you go back to document the product, you forget to take that step back and you write the docs as if you're talking to yourself. But the problem is that first-time users won't have the same frame of reference. So any unexplained term or skipped step in the process can really destroy that learning journey for your reader. What you need to remember is that no matter how intuitive you think your tool might be or how advanced you think your users are, everyone starts somewhere and everyone is a beginner at some point in time. What I found to be effective is to go through the entire process from start to finish and talk out loud while you're doing it. At the same time, have another colleague, preferably someone who's not working on the same project, take notes about what you're doing and points where they might be confused or things that are unclear. Next, I want to touch on something that is almost equally as prevalent in documentation as words, and that's code. Code snippets are understandably very common in documentation, so we should give them just as much care as the text that we write. I'll start by pointing out that code snippets should never be screenshots. This is for accessibility reasons, sure. Without any alt text, the code is unreadable for those using assistive technologies. But logically speaking, it's much more in your favor to write out the code. That way people can copy and paste it to try it themselves or even interact with the code if you have some sort of playground embedded in your docs. As an alternative to screenshots, we can follow semantic HTML principles and use a code tag for inline code. For example, if you're mentioning a specific function name within a written sentence. Then if we want to expand into an entire block of code, we can use the pre element. That way the text is formatted exactly as it's written in the HTML file. And this is what's being used when you use those like triple backticks in Markdown. And speaking of Markdown, code blocks are part of the Markdown spec, as I just mentioned, but syntax highlighting isn't necessarily. So, however, some renderers, like GitHub, do support syntax highlighting, but what you have to do is write the language name after the backticks. Another issue that pops up in code snippets are these like nondescript variable names. This is because foo, bar, baz, insert another 3-letter word here, have no context or any sort of indicator for what they could be representing, which means that our readers are more likely to lose their understanding. The same applies for a single letter variable name unless it's really explicitly explained. Instead, we want to use meaningful placeholders and use those as tools for teaching. In a discussion about this, Ellie, a developer based in London, once said, "We can have variable names that are both meaningful and generic, that expose their purpose via their semantics." She uses the example of an array, and I want to dig into that a bit further. Here's an array named Baz with 2 items, foo and bar. Say I'm learning what arrays are and how to work with them. These variable names are way too abstract. So instead, we can name our array list of fruits and call those items apples and oranges, apples and bananas. I don't know, some sort of fruit, whatever I wrote on there. So this is descriptive and I understand what's going on, but we don't even need to take it that far. You could also name the array something like array name and then list item 1 and item 2. It's not the most creative, but at least it's promoting comprehension. So now that we've covered the literal words and code that we will write in our docs, I also want to briefly talk about maintaining our documentation, whether it's individual articles or doc apps overall. Structure and hierarchy are essential for this. When you work as a technical writer, typically the first thing you learn is that well-structured content is the best foundation for great documentation. But again, it's more of an ideal than a reality in many cases. But it's important to consider because the structure of our docs shape that learning journey and overall experience for our readers. So we want to make sure we have a clear structure that they're able to follow. And when you're writing and in doubt, you can aim for something like this. Talk about one specific feature, go on to explain the use cases, and finally offer solutions for tooling, integrations, etc. This covers all of your bases. You have those information-oriented docs that explain the feature, goal-oriented, because by showing use cases, that could either maybe inspire your readers or address their needs directly. And then you can suggest tools that will lead the reader to what you believe that they should learn next. And the final issue I'm going to cover today is an issue of fit. The product you're documenting isn't appropriate for the person reading, and this causes confusion. So what we can do is we can be transparent. When you know there's a specific use case that doesn't work, say something. You'll save people a lot of headaches in the long run, and I promise that it won't destroy your business. In your introductory material, for instance, you can remind people to double check that this tool is appropriate for what they're actually doing. The reason documentation does this well, in their converting from JavaScript page, they emphasize that you should make sure reason fits your needs. It also points out that you shouldn't, quote, unnecessarily thrash your colleagues over their languages or framework choices. But for the record, that is always unnecessary. So I hope I've given you a new tool to implement or maybe ways to update your existing documentation checklists. But before I stop talking, I want to leave you with one last thing that I learned during my time as a technical writer. So back in the days, I worked at a company called Contentful in Berlin. And when I first read through their style guide, something immediately struck me. At the very beginning, it says, "We aim for accuracy and consistency." Sure, this is the case for most documentation, but what really got me was what came next. More importantly, we aim to be honest, helpful, and human. Honest in that we communicate the pros and cons of a solution because in doing so, we build trust. Helpful, we want our users to succeed. Their success is ultimately our success. And human, we want to feel familiar and approachable. Because after all, you and anyone else reading or writing your documentation are humans too. So thank you. So here's that list of resources again. And if you want to chat about any of these things, I'm available on Twitter. And I'm excited to see what questions come up. And that's the end.
And we're back in the studio. Thank you, Carolyn. I think that was one of those classic Carolyn Stransky talks that, you know, every time I see you at a conference, it's always a pleasure. Let's bring Carolyn on. Hey, Carolyn.
Hi.
Did you go and change a shirt?
I was thinking that. I was like, oh my God, I should have had like a seamless, I should have either like leaned into the outfit change or I should have worn the same thing. But it's fine.
Yeah. Thank
this
you.
This one says write the docs though, so it's on theme.
Right, we have some. I'm sorry I gave you the impression that I care about what clothes you're wearing. I was just trying to be sort of like, you know, nice. Can we talk about your talk? Can we talk about your talk, Carolyn? Because I think people would find that way more interesting than what you're wearing. Okay.
Fine.
And I noticed that you also shared all your resources and your slides on Slack. So that's, you know, I always procrastinate that and hope that people forget. But one thing that we don't have a lot yet is questions. So I have a couple of questions myself that we can get started with, and then hopefully we can have get a few more from the audience as people get over their shyness. So
yeah, please.
Here's something that I've always thought about, and I think you are the perfect person to answer this. Okay. How much is it okay, or even beneficial to use humor in documentation?
Yeah, so I get questions like this a lot, especially not necessarily, I think you're maybe the first person to ask about humor, but also things like metaphors or idioms. And I don't know. I mean, I know it sounds like documentation has this reputation for being really dry and really boring. But I mean, I would err on the side of not trying to add humor in the sense of like, I think especially it's really hard to localize. So if you know you have an international audience, it's really difficult. They're really difficult to translate if you're doing any sort of internationalization on your docs or your website. And they can be really hard to maintain. Like jokes go out of date really quickly, particularly people ask about like memes and like, I think we see on Twitter that like one meme is popular one day and then it goes off the next. So you want to make sure that like what you're putting into your docs is something that's maintainable and something that you're able to kind of keep up with as your product and system and audience grows. And I don't think humor fits into that.
Yeah, this is something that I kind of learned. So many moons ago, I released an open source project called Redux Offline that my friends kind of jokingly called a really good piece of documentation with some really garbage code attached to it. But when other people started to contribute to that, I found that other contributors really struggled to keep up sort of kind of tone, or they kind of like the way, because I was using a lot of metaphor and a lot of like sort of phraseology and terms of speech that weren't like necessarily replicable. Is there like like kind of like a guide or like a tone, like how to sound serious without sounding boring?
Just I don't know if there's really a guide for it, but I mean, a lot of big projects, if you're contributing to their documentation, will have some sort of like style or tone guide, which is something that I think a lot of people are really like, ooh, it sounds really marketing-y. Yeah, spoiler alert, as we talked about in the fireside chat, a lot of this is marketing and it's good. And I think there are ways that you can, at least if you're like maintaining an open source community, you can have those kind of resources available if you want to keep up a particular guide and tone. I think having things like, who are you talking to? Like, are you talking to someone formally? Are you talking to someone like, do you want your docs to sound like a conversation between friends? And I realized I'm like talking and I actually don't even know if I'm answering your question, but.
Well, no, you definitely are. I think what would be helpful is like for people to see an example, because like, if you look at like, if you have ever worked with a company that has like a branding or marketing department, they will always, like include a sort of like, a tone of voice as part of their branding guidelines, because, content is brand, content is like huge part of how you put yourself out in the world. Can you think of any like software projects, like open source projects that have attempted like kind of like a tone of voice guide that people could go look at?
Putting me on the spot. I was gonna say this is kind of ignoring what you just said, but on the same topic of, I think if people are interested in building these kind of style guides and like, where do I start and like, what kind of tone do I want my docs to take? So Write the Docs is a really nice documentation community full of well, they're called documentarians. So it's anyone who has a hand in writing documentation, whether it's, engineers, information architects, technical writers, product owners, customer support, anyone. And they have on their website, under their documentation guide, a whole section on writing style guides, and particularly like, what do you need? What are the different tools to create one? How do you come up with your unique voice? So that's like the resource I would point people to as far as like documentation with a particular.
I think you've answered the question perfectly. Okay. I think a guide is probably better than an example. So that was called Write the Docs, right?
Yes, writethedocs.org.
Cool. Yeah, I will definitely check that out. We have some questions from the audience. Let me read you the first one. Yeah, so Yuhis is asking, writing documentation is quite different from writing code. What recommendations would you give for someone very technical who would like to improve and become better at writing for people?
Oh my gosh, I would point them again to Write the Docs. I think they just have such a good comprehensive documentation guide. That's usually my point of reference for anything in that. And if you really want to start getting involved in that, I think the community is really good.
Spoiler alert, I'm going to start, like, I'm working on, I didn't really want to talk about it because it's like so early, but I want to work on creating these kind of like guides and details. I have this kind of, I can't decide if it should be like a course or like a PDF. I don't know. So if you want to follow me, I might have those. But yeah, Write the Docs is just like, it'll point you in all the directions you need, really.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend following at Carol Strand on Twitter. Not only do you get info and documentation, but also you get interesting news about her neighbors. So I think I would definitely go there. But now we have another question. This is from I believe Lucia Nazzaro. I probably am mispronouncing that name, but here we go. Anyway, do you have any tips on how we could spread the messaging, such as like caring for everyone from every side? Company-wise, especially when talking about everyday insensitive words that people might not even realize that are insensitive. Do you have any experience that you could share on that?
Yeah, of course. I will start by saying that it is not always easy. So I wrote a guide about like how to remove condescending language from your docs, and people are mean, but I think it's really a pursuit worth going towards, because I think a large majority of people use terms that they, it's just part of their everyday vernacular. Like they just say it and don't think about, the implications of it. And I think once you kind of can educate people and explain to people why these terms are harmful, that's why I really like that self-defined dictionary from Tatiana Mack, and being able to offer alternatives. I think that is the most crucial thing, because if you just tell people like, okay, you can't use that term, then it doesn't really give them anywhere to go. And people tend to feel really restricted in what language they can use. But if you offer alternative words or ways that they can maybe work to describe better, like what they're trying to say, then it gives people more of a freedom in that sense. I also think I'm a big fan of metrics in documentation. So making sure that your documentation, has analytics, and that you're able to see kind of where users are going and where they're dropping off, because many times that'll correlate to how comprehensive and how inclusive your documentation is. So you can use like solid metrics to back it.
Oh,
and usability studies.
Yeah. And I think like one thing that I would say to this, not that, she cares about my opinion, but,
I do.
One thing I would like tie here is the thing that you said about linters is that like linters are really good at, sort of like, especially inside a company in like, like enforcing the message. Like, even if you can't reach everybody at emotional level, you can definitely reach them when your PR, fails to get merged. So, I think tooling is a really good help there. But we have some couple more questions.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
No, sorry. I was just going to say that's also the other thing is like, at least in my experience with some of my previous colleagues, it's like having that big red X really kind of drives in the point of like, and this actually goes into, I'm looking at the questions as well. It goes into the question of like, what review processes have you used for docs? And I think having something that literally breaks the build helps kind of drive in that point, because it's a clear message of like, this doesn't work. And it goes into, there's this concept in documentarian land called like docs as code. And it's the idea of treating code or treating documentation the same way you treat your code. So having a code review process, having, pull requests, and using Git for versioning, and using it or any sort of versioning tooling, and being able to go through that and having a PR checklist the same way that you would have that before you merge a feature. So, yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree. Let me pop in like at least one more question while we have time. There are more questions here that we have, time for, but some of these are kind of relevant to documentation in general. So if you don't get your question answered now, we will try to answer them on the next sessions as they relate to other people's talks as well. But this one is from Ante Tomic, and this one is really a good question, because this is what I struggle with always, which is how to balance how detailed documentation should be, so that we are not too detailed with the targeted audience. Because I come from a writing background, and I have an infinite capability of producing reams of text. and it doesn't actually serve the audience because, like if it's too long or too detailed, people can't really parse the signal from the noise. So how do we kind of cater for both audiences, those that I want the nitty gritty and those just want the overview?
So I think there's kind of two parts to this answer. I think there's the idea of how you format your documentation. I mentioned this in the talk, but having, maybe collapsible notes so that if people run into errors, they can open it and be able to see that, but it doesn't distract other people who might not be having that. Linking out to definitions of terms so that if someone's reading the docs and they don't understand a concept or a term, you have a resource for them. But if someone does, they can continue to read. So there's like those little tips, but then there's also this idea of, treating in the same vein of treating docs like code. There's this idea, there's the idea of user experience in documentation and being able to, sit down with someone and have them read through your docs and see like someone who's part of your target audience and listen to the feedback that they have on it, be able to think about like, what does someone need to do to go from like 0 to 100 on a clean machine with my product? And that I think is a nice foundation for really any feature, but I think for documentation, and I think people get a little intimidated because it's like, oh my God, usability tests, it sounds so long, but it can even just be, 10-minute phone calls just to make sure that you are covering everything necessary, or with another colleague on a different team.
Yeah, I think like, the key here, that's something that like, took me many years, as I was, moving on from, junior to a more senior engineer, was that like every part of a product is part of the product. Like documentation is equally important as, your help desk, and your help desk is equally important to the code and the product. And the code is as important as the design, and the design is as important as the content, the text, like all of this just forms like one holistic sort of product piece. And I think, finally, we only have a minute and a half. And, this is a question from Georgiana, is how to evangelize documentation to other software engineers when they find it not useful or just a pain in the ass, basically. They think that the truth should be in the code. So like, taking this, like everything is the product list, like how do you tell people that in 1 minute?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I think this would be also a really good question to loop in everyone. But I think also emphasizing that, 1 minute is so stressful. Okay. I think the idea of like looping in that, like the idea of not everyone is going to have the same perspective you do. So, I mean, and also your code, have you ever looked at code that you wrote 2 weeks ago, 3 months ago, 5 years ago? Like, no one understands it. And I think documentation should be a collaborative process, not just in engineering, but it should be something you refer to like in your whole organization. So you should be able to loop in people from sales, loop in people from product, and because they will have that customer perspective that you might not always have as someone who is just building it out, or not just building out, but who is really nitty gritty deep into the code. So being able to have that kind of outside perspective to evangelize your focus. I don't know. There's so much. I could talk about this forever. There's so much more, but I don't know.
I think you've touched on like many very interesting points that we can leave for the panel. So let's table that, take a note, and then we can pick it up. So you can also, gather your thoughts right now and sound really smart in the panel and beat us all, because everybody knows panels are about winning. So thank you for your talk, Carolyn. Thanks for speaking with me. We're gonna head to the next talk now, and then I'll see you at the panel.